So, when H.G. Wells first came up with the concept of the time machine, it seemed like a pretty straightforward idea. If you've got a protagonist in the modern day and you want him to fight medieval knights or dinosaurs or futuristic mutants, he could simply get into his time machine and go backwards or forwards in time to do those things. The past was literally another country. It was just another location you could go to. But it wasn't long before people realised that what you did in that other country could affect what happened here. And, that what you did in that other country could have a rebound effect on your own time. Puzzlingly, the first thing most people wanted to do when they realised this was kill their granddad. I don't know why this is. Personally, I like my grandfather. But the fact was, once it was an option, it opened up some mind-boggling implications. If your grandfather dies before you're born, your parents won't ever be conceived, you won't ever be conceived, so who's going to shoot your granddad? For the writer, that opens up all kinds of fascinating options, but at a cost. One thing causing another is the simplest definition we have of a story. If you muck about with that, events can quickly become tangled up in themselves. That's what this talk's going to be about. We're going to talk about the different sets of time travel rules, the different systems you can apply, and the advantages and pitfalls of each of them. So let's start with the absolute simplest set of rules. What happens stays happened. You can't change history. You can take your DeLorean back in time, try to shoot your granddad, but you miss. You try again, but the gun jams. You get a new gun, shoot him in the head at point-blank range, and it turns out he wasn't actually a real granddad, and if you'd asked your grandma, she'd have told you that that guy always died that way. This version of time travel is one that is very popular, and a lot of scientists seem to like it, less for any actual scientific reason than because of a vague feeling that anything else would just get silly. I intend to show you that they vastly underestimated our potential for silliness. For instance, often in these stories, an attempt to change history won't just fail, it will cause the thing it was trying to prevent. You go back in time to kill your grandfather, but through an intricate set of incredibly slapstick events, you actually end up saving his life. It's a model that works well for the writer because actions have permanent consequences. The events in chapter 3 won't be negated by the events in chapter 12 later on. Time machine ex machina can't create a quick fix to all your problems. Yet there's still plenty of potential for the writer to play around. Your writer can't change history, but the path of a story can be far from linear, often taking on the format of a detective story. It begins at the end, and then spends the narrative working out how the protagonist got there. The Time Traveller's Wife is a perfect example of this sort of story. The tale of Henry de Tumble, who frequently finds himself bouncing naked and uncontrollably through time. For unknown reasons, nakedness is a big part of time travel. The story is narrated by Henry and his wife Claire, who meet for the first time when Claire is 6 and Henry is 36, and for the first time again when Claire is 20 and Henry is 28. Throughout the story, they experience the exact same events, but in a different order. Henry can't change the past. His mother's death in a car crash, an accident on an ice rink, the time his father walks in on him making out with his future self. These are things that he can't prevent. But he's not powerless. He can win the lottery whenever he feels like it. He can use his future knowledge to manipulate people and give 6-year-old Claire a list of times and places he will appear in the future. Which brings up an interesting point. You can go back in time and help yourself so long as you remember yourself doing it. That's not changing history, it's creating a loop. My favourite example of this is in the third best time-travelling robots movie ever, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. At the climax of this film, At the climax of this film, the future world-saving band, the Wild Stallions, face off against a villain who has come back in time to destroy them. It seems they're doomed until Bill comes up with a foolproof plan. After we get away from this guy, we use the time machine, we time travel back to before the concert and set up the things we need to get him now. At that point, it turns out a sandbag and a cage have been set up from the top, have been set to drop from the top of the ceiling, disarming the bad guy and trapping him. The bad guy's response to this is to point out that when he has defeated Bill and Ted, he's going to go back in time and set himself up with the key to the cage and a spare gun. Promptly, it turns out he has both those items. Only for the gun to turn out to be a dud, because only the winners get to go back in time and set things up. Bill and Ted apparently set the key and the gun up for kicks. Throughout all this, history never changes. The cage and the sandbag and the dud gun were always there, waiting in the rafters. So let's push this further with another completely hypothetical example. Supposing that in the run-up to this talk, rather than carefully researching and writing my talk, I spent a lot of time playing Bombermine and checking my Facebook page. Then it gets to the day of the talk, and I've written absolutely nothing. It looks like I'm going to make an absolute fool of myself, but then an envelope drops through the front door, and it's got a USB stick in it, which has this very talk written on it. I come along, I give the talk, it goes down spectacularly well, and then I get in my DeLorean, travel backwards in time, and push the same envelope with the same USB stick through my own front door. There's no paradox here. History has never changed. I always receive the talk. I always give the talk back. But it still raises the question, who actually wrote this talk? Aside from puzzles like that, an unchanging space-time continuum has other downsides. It can lead to characters having to behave unnaturally just so the plot stays consistent with itself. It's fair to say most people who found themselves back in time would try to alter history just to see what happened. We're spiteful like that. But if a writer acknowledges that, they must create ever more contrived circumstances and coincidences to keep time on the correct path, eventually leading to the somewhat dodgy practice of talking about time as if it's an anthropomorphic entity. So let's look at another version. Let's say the future is not set. That's a quote from another nude time travel movie, The Terminator. At first glance, it seems to be of the go back in time to prevent something, inadvertently cause it to happen school. Arnold Schwarzenegger goes back in time to prevent John Connor from ever being born, and in the process accidentally introduces Sarah Connor to John's father. It seems to be a perfect loop. But throughout The Terminator, James Cameron keeps dropping hints that history can be changed. Aside from the quote about the future not being set, Kyle Reese tells us he's from one possible future. Then, to drive it home, in the second film, John, Sarah, and a friendly Terminator find Skynet's creator, blow up all his research, and prevent the whole apocalypse. It neatly explains why we didn't all die in a nuclear holocaust in 1997, and gives John and Sarah a happy ending, while also, crucially, meaning that Terminators 3 and 4 never happened. Now, I prefer these types of story. I feel the stakes are higher if the future is changeable, that you can invest more in characters who can take full responsibility and blame for their actions. However, that comes at a cost. If history is unchangeable, you can stick your story's perspective anywhere you like. No matter what angle you're looking at it from, the events always stay the same. However, if you're changing history, the events change, and where you're looking at it from is going to become increasingly important. The easiest solution to this is to keep your perspective nailed to the time traveller. If your time traveller is likely to be the only one who notices history changing. They know what history was like before and why it changed and what it was like afterwards. Alternatively, you can place your perspective with a character from the past that's being travelled to, like the Terminator does. Here, you won't see history change, you just see how the time traveller is influencing events. That time traveller may explain how things were before, but you only see one version of history unfold. If you want to be really ambitious, you could try setting the perspective in the future that's being changed. But here it gets complicated. Your character's memories will be changing from scene to scene, and the reader will be the only one who can actually see what's going on. To do that, you need to be good at getting information to your readers subtly, and will have to depend on them to fill in the blanks for you. Regardless of your perspective, though, we still have one question to answer. What happens when you shoot Grandad? A popular option is that when you shoot Grandad, you mysteriously fade away as you are erased from existence. This is a version of Changeable history you'll be familiar with from Back to the Future, or slightly more gruesomely in Looper. In Back to the Future, Marty McFly travels back to 1955, accidentally disrupting his parents' first meeting and negating his own existence. We can tell he's done this because his siblings start to fade away one by one from a family photo he's holding, eventually with his own guitar hand disappearing. In Looper, a time traveller on the run from the mob starts to see his fingers disappear one by one as his past self is brutally tortured. This version has its advantages in that it allows you to see pretty much instantly how history is changing without having to constantly nip forward in time to see what's happening. However, it does present this bizarre meanwhile in the future style logic that can twist your brain in knots if you spend too long thinking about it. It's not for no reason that the characters in Looper go out of their way to tell the audience not to think about the time travel logic because it'll fry your brain like an egg. And that's before George McFly starts to wonder why his third child looks exactly like his wife's high school crush. Still, if you want to change history while still keeping your plot internally consistent and avoid all that meanwhile in the future stuff, we can do that too. We just have to cheat. We get our gun, we climb into our DeLorean and head back in time to a nice little cafe where your grandfather's sitting down for lunch. Your gun is in perfect condition, you're going to be firing at point blank range, you've performed extensive DNA testing to prove this is in fact your biological grandfather. All our bases are covered. You walk in, pull the trigger, and there are Grandad brains all over the walls. At this point, time splits in two. In the first timeline, your granddad finishes his lunch in peace and goes on to have grandchildren who harbour some sort of unspecified resentment towards him. In the new timeline, he doesn't. You're not about to disappear. You're fine. You're from timeline 1. While in timeline 2, you were never born. When you return to the future, it won't be a future you recognise, and nobody's going to recognise you. In timeline 1, you have your cake. In timeline 2, you eat it. We can resolve all kinds of paradoxes with this logic. So remember the paradox of who actually wrote this? Well, originally there was one timeline where I didn't write the talk in time, turned up here and looked really quite embarrassed. Unable to live with the unbearable humiliation, I write the talk, go backwards in time, and push it through my letterbox. That starts the loop, and from then it spreads out across the timelines as the different versions of me each pick it up, go backwards in time, and drop it off again. But it doesn't solve everything. Firstly, if your time traveller prevents their past self from going back in time, there's no paradox, but there are now two time travellers hanging around. This model doesn't explain what happens to the original timeline, whether it breaks down and disappears as soon as the time traveller leaves, or whether it's going to go on without them. If it keeps going on without them, What is the point in Skynet sending the original Terminator back to kill John Connor? And why send Kyle back to stop him? Skynet's already beaten in Timeline 1. It also begs the question, in the original timeline, who actually is John Connor's dad? Finally, there are all the implications of Kyle Reese's phrase, one possible future. If there's more than one possible future, why only have time travelers coming from one of them? Personally, I'm waiting for a Terminator Planet of the Apes crossover, where hyper-evolved apes duke it out with robots to determine who gets to overthrow humanity. Basically, I want Arnold Schwarzenegger to fight a gorilla. Because fundamentally, that's the important thing. Not how consistent your time travel rules are, but what stories they let you tell. A time machine doesn't make a story on its own. The stories we've talked about here are a complicated romance, a dweeb in the 50s trying to get the girl, a young man seeing the person he will become, and killer robots, which do make a story on their own. Time travel lets us show relationships we otherwise couldn't. How a parent and child get on when they're both the same age. What you'll think of your future self. Seeing how your own life might have changed if things had turned out differently. The point is, if your characters are convincing and compelling enough, you can get away with your time travel logic being as sloppy as you like. Thank you.